The notice had been taped to the inside of the glass for 4 days, and Eli Tanner had stopped pretending he didn't see it. He stood at the workbench of Tanner's small engine and repair, with a carburetor in pieces in front of him, wiping his hands on a rag that had given up being a rag sometime around the second Bush administration, and he read the county seal one more time the way a man reads a weather report he can't change. In order of foreclosure sale, a date, a dollar figure, the kind of paper that turns a life into a line item. Outside on Depot Street, the morning moved past him the way it always did. 2 women paused on the sidewalk near his door, coffee cups in hand, and one of them glanced through the glass at the gray-haired man bent over a bench, then looked away as easily as she'd have looked away from an old fuse box. That's the fix-it fella, Tanner. Army, somebody said. No wife, no kids that anybody knows. Word is he's losing the place now, too. The bell over the door of the bakery across the street rang, and they were gone, and Eli went back to the carburetor, because the carburetor was something he could actually finish. 9 days. In 9 days, the whole town of Hessler, Tennessee, would gather on the courthouse steps to watch Eli Tanner lose everything he had. And every last one of them would go home unable to say a word. But to understand how a man who'd once been called dad by 3 girls ended up alone with a foreclosure notice and $147 to his name, it helps to go back 18 years to a March afternoon when the phone on the shop wall rang and Eli almost didn't pick it up. Hessler sat in the lap of the Cumberland foothills, about 2,600 people, one stoplight that blinked yellow after 9, a Baptist church, a Methodist one for the people who weren't speaking to the Baptists, and a Dollar General that had killed the grocery in '02, the kind of place where everybody knew a man's truck before they knew his face. Eli lived a half-mile up Coyle Hollow Road in the cabin his grandfather had raised by hand in 1951, chestnut logs, a tin roof that sang in the rain, a porch with 1 chair on it. He was 42 that spring. He'd been out of the Army 9 years, and he wore it the way some men wear an old coat, not for show, just because it fit. He woke before the sun without an alarm, a habit 22 years deep that no amount of civilian living had managed to sand off. He made his bed with corners. He hung his wrenches on the pegboard by size, smallest to largest, left to right, and when one was missing, he felt it the way other people feel a missing tooth. When he walked into a room he didn't know, his eyes found the exits before they found the furniture, and he'd long ago stopped trying to explain that to anyone. There was a canvas medic bag hanging on a nail behind the shop counter, faded to the color of weak tea, the red cross on the flap so worn it was more memory than color. He didn't open it much. He didn't need to. He knew everything in it by the weight. Above the workbench, written in grease pencil on a strip-spock packing tape that he replaced every year or so when it yellowed, were 6 words a man named Top Reyes had said to him in an aid station a long way from Tennessee, the first week Eli ever held a life that wasn't his own and felt it slipping. Whoever's in front of you is yours to keep. Eli had been a combat medic, a 68W. He'd carried other men's blood home under his fingernails, and he'd learned somewhere in all of it that a man didn't get to choose who landed in front of him. He only got to choose what he did about it. 600 miles south and a whole different planet away, in a glass tower in Atlanta with her name on the lobby wall, a woman named Vivian Ashford was deciding what to do about a person, too. She did it the way she did everything, quickly and without raising her voice. A folder sat closed on the desk in front of her. She did not open it. She slid it back across the glass to the thin man in the gray suit who'd brought it and said, "I don't see why this is mine to handle." The thin man, whose name was Marsh Keller, put the folder back in his bag and said nothing, because saying nothing was most of what Marsh Keller was paid for. The folder went back into the dark, and Vivian Ashford went to a board meeting, and for 18 months neither of them thought about it again. The phone on Eli's shop wall rang at 4:10 on a Tuesday. He almost let it go. He had the carburetor half together, and his hands were black, and the machine on the string side of those calls was usually somebody who wanted a price they weren't going to like. But he wiped his hands and picked it up, because that was a habit, too. "Tanner Repair." "Mr. Tanner?" A woman's voice, careful, the careful of somebody who'd rehearse the next part. My name is Renata Pike. I'm with the county, Department of Children's Services. A pause where she let him decide whether to hang up. He didn't. I'm calling about. Another pause. I'm calling about Daniel Ledford. Eli set the rag down on the bench, very slowly, the way a man sets down something he might need to pick back up. Danny, he said. You knew him. I served with him. A long time ago in a desert that didn't make the news anymore. And then the war ended for both of them, and they did what men do, which was promise to keep in touch and then not. He'd heard Danny married a girl named Cora. He'd never met her. He'd never met anybody from her side. They'd lost the thread the way a thread is lost, a little at a time and then all at once. How is he? The line was quiet for long enough that Eli already knew. He and his wife passed, Mr. Tanner. Car accident, back in the fall, both of them the same night. Renata Pike took a breath he could hear. They left 3 girls. Eli looked at the medic bag on its nail. There are 3 of them, she went on, and now the rehearsed part was gone, and it was just a tired woman at the end of a long day telling the truth. Della's 13. Sloane's 10. Ren is 6. They've been in 4 placements in 18 months, and every one of them sent the girls back. The last family, she stopped herself. There were reasons. The point is, nobody will take all 3, and I will not split them up. And if I can't find somewhere by Friday, the state's going to do it for me. 3 girls, 3 different counties. They've already lost everything else. Why are you calling me? He heard paper move on her end. Because your name is in their file, Mr. Tanner. Daniel listed you. Emergency contact next to friend. Bet he wrote it in by hand. Eli Tanner, Hessler, TN. He'll know what to do. She let that sit. I'll be honest with you. I've been calling people for 2 days. You're the only name on this whole file that picked up the phone. Outside the shop window, the light was going gold and long the way it did in March, and a man Eli's age in a clean quilted vest was crossing the street toward the diner, and that was Conrad Pyle, who owned the Pyle Motors lot out on the highway and a seat on the county commission, and who would, before the month was out, stand at that same diner counter and say to 3 other men that he didn't know what the county was thinking, putting 3 little girls with a single man, an army man at that. No telling what those years did to a fella's head. It just didn't look right. Conrad would say it the way people say things that sound reasonable if a person doesn't know anything, and most of Hessler didn't. But that was later. Right now there was just a phone, and a woman waiting, and 6 words on a strip of masking tape. Della, Sloane, and Ren, Eli said. Getting the names right because getting the names right mattered. Danny's girls, Renata Pike agreed. He thought about the cabin. He thought about the 2 bedrooms upstairs he hadn't opened in years, the one that had been his grandmother's and the one that had been meant, a long time ago, for a different life that hadn't happened. He thought about the tin roof and the wood heat, and the fact that a half-mile up a holler in winter was no place to be without a working truck, and his truck made a sound on cold mornings that he didn't love. He thought about how he barely fed himself most weeks. He thought about a 6-year-old who'd lost her mother, her father, and 4 homes before she'd lost all her baby teeth. Mr. Tanner? Bring them here, Eli said. There was a silence on the line that he would remember for the rest of his life because it was the silence of somebody who had stopped expecting to hear those words. You don't want to think about it? I've been thinking about it the whole time you were talking. He looked at the tape above the bench. Whoever's in front of you is yours to keep. Danny had put his name in a file with a pen, trusting that it would mean something to somebody someday. It meant something. Friday's fine. Tell me what they need. When he hung up, the shop was quiet except for the tick of the cooling space heater and a wren, a real one, singing somewhere out past the gravel lot, which he would think about later and decide not to mention to anyone, because it sounded made up and the truest things usually do. That evening, Eli climbed the cabin stairs and opened the 2 doors that had been closed so long the hinges complained. Floors that didn't have much dust on them because nobody used them. He carried up a cot from the shop and a lamp from the hall and stood in the doorway of the smaller room a while, doing math in his head that didn't come out, the way it never had and never would for anything that mattered. 3 girls. Friday, 42 years old, single, broke, half a mile up a holler, with a leaking truck and 100 and change in the bank and a war in his hands that he'd mostly made peace with. He did not know, standing in that doorway with a broom, that the youngest of the 3 would come up his gravel path in 4 days holding a brass compass against her chest like a shield, a compass with a stranger's coat of arms cut into the lid and a secret folded under its false bottom that would take 17 years to come to light. He did not know any of it yet. He only knew that on Friday 3 girls nobody wanted were coming, and that the door was open wider than was comfortable, and that this was, as far as he could tell, the whole point. Friday came in gray and damp, the sky low over the ridgeline and a fine rain that wasn't quite committed to falling. Eli had the porch swept and the wood stove going, and a pot of chili on the back burner, because it was the only thing he knew how to make for more than one person. He'd bought sheets. He'd stood in the aisle at the Dollar General for 10 minutes over the sheets, because he didn't know what girls liked, and a teenage cashier had finally said, "Mister, just get the ones with stars. Everybody likes stars." And so he'd gotten the ones with stars, and that was the most fathering thing he had done in his life up to that point. He heard the county car before he saw it, the slap of tires on wet gravel coming up the holler. Not a van, a dusty white sedan. Renata Pike got out first, and then the doors opened and the girls came out into the drizzle one at a time, and Eli came down off the porch and stopped a respectful distance away, the way a man stops near a deer he doesn't want to spook. The oldest came first and put herself between the car and her sisters without seeming to decide to. 13, tall for it, with her father's jaw. Eli saw Danny in her so suddenly it took the air out of him, and eyes that swept the cabin, the tree line, the shop, Eli himself, sorting all of it into threats and not threat. Della. She had been the parent for a while now. It showed in the way she stood, and a kid who's been the parent doesn't hand the job back just because an adult shows up. She'd seen adults show up before. Behind her came the middle one, 10, wiry, a scab healing on one knuckle and a set to her shoulders like she was looking for a reason. Sloan. When Eli's eyes passed over her, she lifted her chin, daring him to say something about the knuckle, and he didn't, and he watched her file that away as suspicious. And half a step behind both of them, almost hidden, was the small one, Wren, 6 years old and built like a sparrow, holding something against her chest with both arms wrapped around it. A brass compass, old, the kind with a hinged lid, and her knuckles were white on it. She did not look at Eli. She looked at the ground, at the mud sucking at her 2 big sneakers, and she did not make a sound. "She doesn't talk," Della said before Eli could ask. She said it flat, defensive, a fact she'd had to defend before. "Not since. Don't make a thing out of it." "All right," Eli said. He did the thing none of the 4 families had done. He went down to one knee in the wet gravel, slow, his bad weather knee telling him about it, until he was level with the smallest of them. "I'm Eli," he said to Wren, not the top of the Sisetian. "This was my grandfather's house. The chili's not very good, but there's a lot of it." Wren's eyes came up off the ground for half a second and found his and went back down. It was enough. "I've got 3 things I'll ask of you, and they're the same 3 for everybody, me included." He'd thought about this on the porch all morning and thrown out the speech twice. "We eat at the same table. We don't leave anybody behind, and this door," he tipped his head back at the cabin, "stays open wider than is comfortable. That last one's not a rule. It's just how the house works." Sloan snorted from behind her sister. "That's barely even rules." "No," Eli agreed. "I guess it isn't." Something moved across Della's face and was gone before it could be named. She'd been braced for a list. People who took a kid in always had a list. When he stood, his eyes caught on the compass in Wren's arms. The lid had turned in her grip, and there was something cut into the brass. A crest, a shield with a tower, and some words he couldn't read at that distance. An expensive thing for a 6-year-old to be carrying up a Tennessee holler. He thought that came from money, and then he thought nothing else about it, because he had known Danny Ledford, and Danny Ledford did not come from money, and Eli had never met the other side of that family or learned their name. The thread had been lost years before there was anything to find at the end of it. He filed it the way he filed a part number he didn't need yet, and he went to get the bags. There were 3 of them, and they did not take 2 trips. That first supper, Della and Sloan ate like the food might be taken away. Heads down, forearms close, eyes up. Eli had seen men eat like that, men back from places where meals weren't guaranteed, and he didn't say anything about it. Just put the pot in the middle of the table and let them go back for more without asking. Wren didn't eat. She moved the chili around the bowl with her spoon and watched it move. "You don't have to talk," Eli told her, not looking at her too hard, looking at his own bowl. "But I'd take it as a kindness if you'd eat something, even a little. It's a long way till morning." Wren looked at him. First time, full on. Then she put a small spoonful in her mouth and swallowed it like it cost her something. Eli felt his throat do a thing, and he got up to get water nobody had asked for so that nobody would see his face do what it was doing. The first months were a war fought in inches. Della tested him the way a soldier tests a bridge before crossing, putting weight on it, watching for the give. She came home late from the school bus stop and offered no account of it. She talked back, looking for the place where the patience ran out. Because everything had a place where the patience ran out. One night she came in well past dark and found Eli sitting on the porch in the cold with a plate covered in foil on his knees. "I don't know where you've been," he said, before she could build whatever she'd built on the walk-up. "You'll tell me when you tell me. But you're going to eat because we don't leave anybody behind, and that includes leaving them out in the cold mad at me." He held the plate out. "It's still warm." Foil's a good trick. She stared at him, waiting for the rest of it. There wasn't any rest of it. She sat down on the cold boards next to him and ate, and they didn't talk, and a screech owl said something stupid out in the dark. And after a while, Della said, around a mouthful, "This is actually pretty good," which from a 13-year-old was the same as a hand on the heart. The next week, she was home before dark. She didn't say why, and he didn't ask. Sloane's pain came out through her fists. 3 calls from the school in 2 months. A boy who'd said something about Wren on the bus. A girl who'd said something about Della. A kid Sloane couldn't even explain afterward. Eli sat in the meetings with the vice principal, a soft man who said unacceptable a lot. And Eli listened to all of it, and then asked one question. "Has anybody asked her why she's fighting? Or do we go straight to the part where she's the problem?" The vice principal didn't have an answer for that. That Saturday, Eli took Sloane out behind the shop where the gravel lot ran out into a tractor path through the pines, and he didn't make her talk about feelings, because he'd have rather chewed glass himself. He pointed at the tree line a quarter-mile off. "You've got a motor in you that runs hot," he said. "I had one too, still do. You can't shut it off, but you can give it somewhere to go." He nodded at the path. "Run to that far fence and back, hard as you want. I'll time you. You beat your time tomorrow. I'll teach you how to take apart that mower carburetor, because you keep looking at my bench like you want to." She ran like she was being chased. She came back gasping and furious, and something in her face had let go a half-inch. The next day, she beat her time. He kept his word, and she stood at his elbow at the bench, with her hands black to the wrist, and for 45 minutes the motor in her had somewhere to be. She came home from her runs tired instead of angry. It was not a cure. There is no cure. But tired was a place they could both live. Wren didn't speak. Not for weeks. Eli didn't push. He'd learned a long way from home that frightened things aren't pulled close. A person makes himself a safe thing to come toward, and then he waits, and waiting is the hardest skill there is. Every night he sat on the floor by her cot and read out loud. Whatever was in the house, an old field guide to Appalachian birds, a paperback Western with the cover gone, the directions off a box of pancake mix once when he couldn't find anything else which got the closest thing to a smile he'd seen out of her. She listened. Her eyes tracked every word. There was a harmonica at the VFW post in town, in a junk drawer behind the bar that Gus Renner let Eli dig through, a battered Hohner somebody had left behind a decade ago. Eli brought it home and didn't give it to her. He just left it on the windowsill in her room, next to the compass she would not be parted from, And he played it badly himself sometimes in the evening on the porch, 3 or 4 notes, no song, just sound, the way a person leaves a light on. One night in the 7th week, tucking the blanket up over her sparrow shoulders, he heard it. A whisper, sot rusted from disuse, so quiet he almost convinced himself he'd made it up. "Will you still be here in the morning?" Eli held very still, the way a man holds still when a wild thing decides to trust him and the wrong move ends it. "I'll be here in the morning," he said, "and the morning after that. Every morning you've got need of me, I'll be here." Wren looked at the ceiling for a while. Then she said, "Okay," and turned over and slept, and did not wake the house with the dreams she usually woke it with. On the Santo Cecil, the harmonica caught a little of the moon. The compass sat beside it, the strange crest turned to the wall. 600 miles south, on the kind of evening where the city held its heat into the dark, Hessler set a single sheet of paper on the glass desk in front of Vivian Ashford and waited while she finished a phone call about a property in Charleston. When she hung up, she looked at the paper without picking it up. It was a printout, a name from a database he kept a quiet subscription to, the kind that flags when certain other names surface in certain kinds of records. The Ledford girls had surfaced, a county placement in Tennessee, a foster home, a man. "You wanted to know if they were settled," Keller said. Vivian read the page from across the desk, which was how she read most things. At a distance, the way she'd learned to hold the parts of her life that had disappointed her. Cora had disappointed her. Cora had taken a perfectly arranged future and set fire to it for a soldier with good shoulders and no name worth saying. And when Cora had written her those letters afterward, and she had written, year after year, asking to come home, ask to be forgiven, asking please, Vivian had not answered a single one, because answering would have meant that the leaving was the kind of thing a person came back from, and it was not. And then Cora was dead, and the children were the children of that mistake. And now they were up a dirt road in Tennessee, being raised by exactly the kind of man who'd started all of it. "They're placed," she said. "It's handled. It's the county's to handle." She slid the page back across the glass. "I don't see why this is mine." She believed it, too. That was the thing about Vivian Ashford that no one who hated her ever understood. She was not a woman who told herself lies. She had simply decided a long time ago which griefs she would carry and which she would set down, and she had set this one down so thoroughly that picking it back up felt less like cruelty than like good sense. The name went back into the dark of Keller's bag. Keller, for his part, slid the page away and said nothing, and noted, because noting was the part of him that he could not fully turn off, that his employer had said it's handled 3 different ways in one breath, which in his experience was how people talked about the things that weren't. The rain came back to Hessler in June, harder than it had any right to, the kind of warm front that stalls against the mountains and sits and sits. It rained for 2 days, and then it rained for a third. Coil Hollow Creek, which ran behind the cabin most of the year at a depth a man could cross it in rubber boots, started to talk in a voice Eli didn't like. He stood on the porch on the 3rd night and watched the water and listened, and 42 years of a body that had learned to read trouble before it arrived told him something was coming. Upstairs, Wren was asleep with the harmonica under her pillow now instead of on the sill. A graduation he hadn't commented on, and somewhere in a drawer 600 miles away, a folded sheet of paper with the Ledford name on it had just been opened a second time, and this time the woman across the desk did not slide it back. The power went out at 2:14 in the morning. Eli knew the time because the bedside clock died mid-number, and the last thing it showed him was 2:14, and then the cabin was the particular black of a house in the mountains with no moon, and under that blackness was a sound that had grown all night from a mutter to a roar. Coil Hollow Creek had stopped being a creek. He was up and moving before he'd finished deciding to. Years fell off a man's habits in the dark. His feet found the floor, and his hand found the flashlight on the nightstand where it always was, because he kept it there for exactly this. And he was halfway down the hall when he heard it over the water. A high, thin, scraping breath. Wren. He found her sitting up on the cot, both hands at her own throat, eyes huge in the flashlight, fighting for air that wasn't coming. He'd seen the inhaler in the bathroom cabinet. He'd noted it the first week. The way he noted everything: child, reactive airway, blue inhaler, top shelf. And he had it in his hand in under a minute and shook it and put it to her mouth and pressed. And it gave one weak sigh and nothing more. Empty. He turned it over. The prescription sticker said it had been filled the month before they ever came to him, in a town he'd never heard of, and nobody had refilled it since. And he felt a flash of something at whatever family had let that lapse, and then he set the something down because the something was not useful and the child was. "Hey," he said, and his voice came out the way it used to come out in the worst places, low and level and certain, a voice with no weather in it at all. "Hey, Wren, look here, you're going to look at me." She did. Terror, but she did. "We've done hard things, you and me. This is just another one. You're going to breathe with me, in through your nose like you're smelling the chili." A thread of a laugh cry caught in her chest, which was good. A laugh used the right muscles. "There it is. Now out slow, like you're cooling it off. Slow. Slower than that." Della was in the doorway, Sloane behind her, both of them gone white. "I'll get the truck," Della said, already the parent, already reaching for the keys on the hook. "Truck won't cross that water, and neither will an ambulance." He'd already done the map in his head. He did maps in his head. It was a thing the Army had left in him like shrapnel. The low-water bridge 100 yards down would be 4 feet under. By now the holler was a bathtub, and they were at the bottom of it. The hard road, the real road, was a mile and change up and over the shoulder of the ridge above the flood, on foot, in the dark, in the rain. "Sloane, bathroom. There's a dry bag under the sink. Orange, my old kit. Bring it, Della. Every dry blanket you can carry and the rain shells off the pegs. We're walking out." They didn't argue. He would think about that later, that two girls who argued with everything didn't argue with this, because some part of them recognized the voice, the way a person recognizes a language they didn't know they spoke. He wrapped Wren in a blanket and then a rain-tree shell over the blanket and got her onto his back with her arms around his neck and her legs hooked through his elbows, and he could feel her breath against the back of his neck, still too fast, still too shallow, but moving. "You keep breathing on my neck," he told her, whole way. "That's your only job. You stop, you tap my shoulder, I'll know." 2 taps for scared, he told her. 1 tap for can't, and felt her nod against him, a 6-year-old learning a code in the dark because the man carrying her had made it sound like the most normal thing in the world. They went out into it. The world past the porch was water and noise. The flashlight caught rain coming sideways and the silver churn where the yard used to be, and the path up the ridge was a streamed now, ankle-deep and pulling. Eli put Della on his right hand and Sloane on his left and made them hold the tail of his jacket, not each other. "Me, you hold on to me." And he started up, reading the ground with his feet because the light only showed him so much, testing each step the way he'd once tested ground for worse things than mud. The creek wanted them. He could feel it through his boots, that low, greedy pull, 9 feet of water where there'd been 18 inches, and he kept them high, kept them to the uphill side, kept his body between the 3 of them and the dark roar below. Somewhere in the middle of it, the water sound did something to him. It always could. A certain pitch of rushing dark, and his body went somewhere it didn't need to go. A wadi at night, a long time ago, a sound he'd spent years learning to walk through instead of into. He felt it start. He took 1 breath that he counted, the way he'd taught 100 scared kids and a few scared adults to count, and he said the 6 words to himself without moving his lips. Whoever's in front of you is yours to keep. And what was in front of him was 3 girls and a ridge, and the wadi let go of him, and they kept walking. Wren tapped twice. He talked her down without breaking stride. She tapped twice again a few minutes later, and he sang badly. The 4 notes he could play on the harmonica turned into a tune that wasn't one. And she didn't tap again after that, just breathed against his neck, in through the nose, out slow, the whole way up. They came over the shoulder of the ridge into the wind, and there was the hard road, black and shining and above the flood, and a 1/4 mile down it, a porch light. Hazel Combs, 71, who'd lived on the high road her whole life and kept a truck that started in any weather out of pure stubbornness, opened her door to a soaked man with a child on his back and two more holding his coat, and didn't ask a single question. Just said, "Lord God, get in, I'll get the keys," which was the most that needed saying. The clinic in town took Wren at the edge of what they could handle. The doctor on call, a tired young woman named Patel, put her on a nebulizer and listened to her chest and watched the numbers come up off the floor, and finally let her own shoulders come down, and she came out to the waiting room where Eli sat with a girl pressed against each side of him, all three of them soaked through and steaming faintly in the fluorescent light, and she said, "Another hour, with that airway and that cold water. I don't like to think about it. Whatever you did out there, you did it right." Eli nodded. He didn't tell her what he'd done out there or where he'd learned it. He'd carried what he was for a lot of years without setting it on the table for strangers. And he wasn't going to start in a clinic waiting room at 4 in the morning. He just held on to the girls and let the heat come back into his hands. It was Della who broke the quiet somewhere near dawn, when Wren had finally fallen asleep across both their laps, and Sloane was 3/4 gone against his shoulder. Della was the kind of awake a person can't talk out of. She watched the gray come up in the window, and she said, not looking at him, "Why do you even do this?" "Do what, hon?" "This, all of it." Her voice was steady, which was how he knew it were not yours. "You didn't have to pick up the phone. You don't get anything for it. The county check is a joke. I've seen what it is. So why?" Eli was quiet for a while. He'd known the question would come. It always came from the ones who'd been let down enough times to do the arithmetic on kindness, looking for the catch, because there was always a catch. "Your dad and I," he said finally, "carried each other through some bad country. That's not a figure of speech. There was a stretch where I was the reason he came home, and there was a stretch where he was the reason I did. You don't walk out of something like that owing nothing." He looked down at Wren's sleeping face, so much her mother's, he assumed, though he'd never met the woman. "One night, the two of us up half of it," he said to me, half joking, the way a man jokes when he means it. He said, "Tanner, anything ever happens to me, you're the only fool I'd trust with my kids." And I said something smart back, because that's what you do. You don't let a thing like that just sit there. But he wasn't joking. Eli's voice thickened and he let it. He'd stopped being ashamed of that a long time ago. He wrote my name in a file, years later, after we'd lost touch, after I'd half forgotten the conversation. He kept his half of it without ever telling me. So when that phone rang, he started again. "There's a thing a man taught me once, when I was younger than you'd think, and holding more than I could carry. Whoever's in front of you is yours to keep. You three were in front of me. That's the whole answer. There isn't a better one." Della didn't say anything. But after a minute, she leaned the small weight of her head against his other arm, the side Sloane wasn't on, and that was the answer to his answer. They went home 2 days later, when the water dropped and the county put a temporary plank across the low-water bridge. The cabin had taken 8 inches in the downstairs. The shop had taken a foot, and a season's worth of other people's engines were ruined, which was a season's worth of income Eli didn't have. He didn't say much about it. He shoveled mud and ran the wet vac and set things in the sun to dry and went back to work, because going back to work was the only prayer he really knew. It was Della again who connected the last wire a week later, dry now and bored and turning the brass compass over in her hands at the kitchen table while Wren napped. "Mama used to have a whole set of stuff like this," she said, "fancy old stuff, from her family, the Ashfords." She said the name like it tasted bad. "They had money, like real money, hotels or something. They cut Mama off when she married Daddy, said he was nobody, said he'd never amount to anything." She ran her thumb over the crest cut into the lid, the little tower. "Grandmother never even called, not when Wren was born. Not when," she stopped, "not at the end. Mama wrote her letters her whole life and she never once wrote back. So no, we don't have family. We had her and she had us, and that's it." Eli looked at the compass in the girl's hands, at the tower stamped in brass, and something cold walked up the back of his neck, the same instinct that had read the creek in the dark. He didn't have a name for it yet, but he understood, in that kitchen, that the girls came from a kind of money he'd never been within a mile of, and that money like that does not lose trace of its own blood by accident, and that somewhere out past the ridgeline there was a person who could, if she ever decided to, reach down into his life and take it apart. He didn't know her name. He didn't know she'd just read it twice. If you've ever shown up for someone with nothing in it for you but the showing up, and stayed long enough to find out it cost you something, then you already know the rest of this story is going to ask whether that ever pays. Stay with it. It does, but not the way anyone in this town would have guessed, because the small kindness of a flood rescue does not stay small. A volunteer with the county emergency crew put it on a regional page. Local vet carries child a mile through floodwater, 3 orphaned sisters now safe. No names, just the shape of it, the kind of thing that travels. And 600 miles south, Marsh Keller, who watched for shapes the way some men watch the weather, set a phone in front of his employer with the post on the screen. Vivian Ashford read it. She read it twice the way she read things that mattered. 3 orphaned sisters, a veteran, a foster placement. Her granddaughters in a newspaper attached to a stranger's act of heroism, the Ashford name nowhere in it and a soldier's at the center, exactly as it had been the first time. The story writing itself the same way it had written itself with Cora, that a man like that was the hero and a family like hers was the thing he'd saved them from. She set the phone down. She was quiet for long enough that Keller thought she might slide it back the way she always did. Find out what it would take, she said instead, to bring them home. Ma'am, they're settled. By every account, the placement is. I heard you the first time you told me they were settled. She turned to the window and the city held its lights up to her. They are Ashfords. They are not going to be raised up a dirt road by the help. Find out what it takes. Keller noted that too, that she'd called the children Ashfords for the first time in 18 months, the moment a stranger's kindness made them worth claiming, and he went to find out what it would take. The strange car appeared at the bottom of Coyle Hollow Road 3 days later, parked past the old oak, engine off, windows dark, too new and too clean for that road. It was there Tuesday. It was there Wednesday. It was there Thursday. And on Friday morning, over the ordinary sounds of an ordinary day, came an engine that didn't belong to anyone in Hessler, low and smooth and certain, climbing the holler toward the cabin. The car was not a car. It was 3 of them, black, identical, climbing the holler in a line, and when they stopped in the mud of Eli's yard, the doors opened with the soft, expensive sound of money idling. A woman got out of the middle one, 60, maybe more, silver hair cut to a blade, a coat that had cost more than the cabin's roof. She looked at the peeling logs and the tin and the shop with the high water stain still on its door, and her mouth made a small motion, not quite disgust, the expression of a person confirming a thing she'd already decided. Behind her came a thin man in gray with a leather case. Marsh Keller. Eli came out onto the porch and stood there, not coming a rag still in one hand because he'd been at the bench when he heard them. Mr. Tanner. Not a question. She did not offer her hand. My name is Vivian Ashford. I've come for my granddaughters. The screen door creaked behind him. Della had come out. Eli saw the exact moment the girl's face changed, saw 13 years and 4 foster homes and 1 drowned holler crawl up into her eyes, and Della said, in a voice scraped down to the wood, "You." Vivian's gaze moved to her and did something complicated and shut. "Della, you're the one," she wrote. The girl's hands had found the porch rail and gone white on it, the same way Wren's went white on the compass. Every birthday, every Christmas, Mama wrote you for years and you never sent back 1 word, not one. And now Daddy's gone and Mama's gone and you drive up here and you're... Her voice cracked, and she hated that it cracked. In your 3 cars. This isn't a conversation for the porch, Vivian said, which was not an answer and was an answer. She turned to Eli. My attorney will explain the situation. I'd prefer this piece. It was not simple, but it was fast, which money can make look like the same thing. What followed took 3 weeks and felt like falling down stairs in slow motion. The Ashford attorneys came from Atlanta and billed by the minute and arrived with bankers' boxes, birth records. The marriage certificate Vivian had refused to attend, a wall of paper built to prove one thing the law in Tennessee still bowed to: blood. Vivian Ashford was the only living blood relative of 3 minor children. Eli Tanner was a foster placement, temporary by definition, a line on a form. Eli got a lawyer. He got the only one he could afford, a young man named Pruitt, 2 years out of school, who worked out of an office over the hardware store and charged $80 an hour and looked. The first time the Atlanta team filed across from him, like a man who'd brought a pocket knife to a war. Eli brought what he had, which was people. Hazel Combs, who told the court about a man carrying a child a mile through floodwater. Dr. Patel, who used the word another hour. A teacher who'd watched Wren go from silent to singing. Gus Renner from the VFW, who stood up in a borrowed jacket and said this was the steadiest man he knew and he'd trust him with his own. None of it weighed what blood weighed. And there was one piece of paper Eli didn't have, the only piece that might have changed it, and he didn't have it because it had never reached him. Because somewhere in the boxes the Ashford estate had swept up after Danny and Cora died, there had been a single notarized document, 2 years old, in which Sergeant Daniel Ledford named Eli Tanner the legal guardian of his children in the event of his death. Danny had done the thing right. Danny had made it more than a line in a file. He'd signed it and stamped it and put it where it was supposed to go. And when the estate was inventoried, that document had been pulled, read, understood, and locked in a drawer 600 miles south because it was the one thing that could have kept 3 Ashford children up a Tennessee dirt road. And the woman who locked it away did not intend to let that happen. Eli could prove he was an emergency contact. He could prove he was a good man. He could not prove he was their guardian because the proof was in the dark, and the court does not rule on what it cannot see. The judge ruled for the grandmother, custody to transfer immediately. Late that night, in the glass tower, Vivian Ashford sat alone with the drawer open. The guardianship document lay on top, Danny's signature steady and certain at the bottom. Under it was something she'd told herself she'd thrown out years ago and hadn't. A banded stack of letters in her daughter's hand, the envelopes soft with handling, every one of them addressed to Mother, and every one of them unanswered. She did not read them. She had never read them. She put the guardianship paper back on top so she wouldn't have to see her daughter's handwriting, and she reached to turn the key, and stopped, because something Della had said on the porch had lodged in her and would not work itself loose. Mama wrote you for years and you never sent back one word. She'd known that. She was the one who hadn't written back. Of course, she'd known it. But she had never, in all the years of not answering, pictured the writing. The girl at a kitchen table somewhere, year after year, choosing a card, a stamp, believing each time that this might be the one. Vivian sat with the key in her fingers, and for a moment something looked out at her from the dark of the drawer that she could not name and did not want to. A cold draft from a room in herself she kept the door shut on. Then she turned the key, and the draft was gone, and she went to bed, because a woman did not run a company by sitting up with drawers. Marsh Keller saw the light under her door at 2 in the morning. He saw it go out. He noted it, the way he noted everything, and he filed it next to the 3 different ways she'd once said it's handled, and he did not yet know what he would do with any of it. But a man who keeps that many notes is keeping them for a reason he hasn't admitted yet. Conrad Pyle had a bad night of his own that week, though it cost him less, and he'd have said it cost him nothing. He'd done a small favor for the Ashford lawyers, a word to the county about the repair contract Tanner held, the one that brought in steady money. Just doesn't seem like the county ought to be in business with a man in the middle of all this. Does it with those poor girls? And the contract had quietly gone to a shop 2 towns over. Conrad had told himself it was about appearances. He'd told himself a lot of things. But he'd driven past the shop on the highway that night and seen Tanner's lights still on at 11. A man working alone on other people's broken machines to keep a roof over 3 kids he was about to lose, and something Conrad had turned over like a motor that won't quite catch. and he'd driven home faster than he needed to, and he hadn't liked the feeling, and he'd done what men like Conrad do with feelings they don't like, which is put them somewhere and shut the lid. The lid did not hold as well as he wanted. He'd find that out years later on a courthouse step. The morning they left, Eli stood on the porch where he'd knelt in the gravel 4 months before. The 3 black cars waited in the yard. He did the hardest thing he'd done since the Wadi, which was hold still and let it happen. Della came first, 16 in the eyes now, though she was still 13, and she didn't cry until she was right in front of him, and then she couldn't stop. "We don't want to go. Tell them. You're supposed to be able to tell them." "I tried, Hahn." His own face was wet, and he let it be. "I tried everything I had. The law doesn't see what we are. That's the law's failing, not yours. Don't you ever carry it." He held her by the shoulders. "You hear me? Not 1 ounce of it is yours to carry." Sloan hit him like a tackle, arms locked around his ribs, the fighter shaking. "Don't let the mad win," he said into her hair, the thing he'd been telling her since the first week, since the tractor path and the stopwatch. "You've got somewhere to put it now. You put it there. You don't let it put you anywhere." She nodded against his chest, furious and tense and breaking. Then she stood in front of him with the compass in both hands, the way she'd held it the first day, and she held it up to him. Her voice, the one it had taken 7 weeks to find, came out steady and far too brave. "Keep it for me. I'm coming back for it." Eli took the compass. It weighed nothing, and it weighed everything. He pressed it flat against his chest with one hand. "I'll keep it safe," he said. "I won't open it. It'll be right where you left it when you come back for it. That's a promise, and you know what I do with those." The cars took them down the holler, one at a time, and turned at the oak and were gone. Eli stood on the porch until the sound was gone too, and then he went inside and put the compass on the mantel, the strange crest turned to the wall, and he went out to the shop and went back to work, because it was still the only prayer he knew, and now he needed it more than he ever had. 17 years is a long time, long enough to wear a man down to the grain. He wrote letters the first year, 1 a week, to the address the court had on file. They came back. "Return to sender," he called. The number had changed. He found a new one through Pruitt. It changed too. He learned the girls had been sent to a school in New England with a name like a law firm and a gate like a prison. And he drove 11 hours and stood at that gate in the cold and was told, politely by a man who was only doing his job, that Mr. Tanner was on a restricted list, and would he please not make this difficult. He drove 11 hours home. He didn't know that the restricted list had a name on the order that authorized it, and that the name was Keller, and that the order had come from a drawer in a glass tower. He only knew the gate was shut. Then the years did to him what years do. The repair contract gone, the shop limped. In 2014, a scaffold gave under him on a side job and put his back wrong for good, so that some mornings he came down the stairs, one at a time, like an old man, which by then he half was. In 2019, his heart stopped behaving in the night, and he drove himself to the clinic, because there was no one to call, and sat in the waiting room with one hand pressed to his sternum, doing the breathing he'd taught 100 scared people, and they put a stent in him and sent him a bill for $31,000 that he paid the way a man eats an ocean, 1 spoon at a time. The town had long since decided what it thought. Conrad's word had done its work. The story had set like concrete. Something must have happened with those girls. Rich grandmother doesn't come take kids for no reason, and Eli let them think it, because the truth was nobody's business and defending it would have meant explaining what he'd lost, and he could not say it out loud and stay standing. But here is the thing they did not know. None of them, not the town and not the woman in the tower. 17 years can wear a man to the grain. It cannot unplant what's already growing, because 600 miles away, 3 girls were becoming 3 women, and everything Eli had put in them was coming up. Della went to medicine. She'd watched a man read a dying breath in a flashlight beam and turn it back, and she never got over it. She became a trauma physician, the kind who's calm in the worst hour of someone's life, and she could not have said where she learned the calm except that it had a Tennessee accent. With two colleagues, she built a small company that made better field gear for rural ambulances, the kind that don't get to a hospital in 8 minutes. And when a larger company bought it, Della Ledford was suddenly a woman with real money of her own, not one dime of it Ashford. Sloan took the motor that ran hot and built things, a construction firm and, beside it, a trade school for kids the system had given up on because somebody had once handed her a stopwatch instead of a suspension. Wren, who had found her voice on a windowsill harmonica, became a music therapist who sat on the floor with children who wouldn't speak and waited, the way she'd once been waited for, and she made records under her own name that did better than anyone expected of a quiet woman singing quiet songs. They looked for him. They looked for years. But Eli Tanner had no digital footprint, no accounts, no email, the same landline he'd had since 1991. And the letters they sent came back, and the searches dead-ended, and they could not have known that some of the doors had been deliberately shut years before by a woman who never explained herself to anyone, least of all to the granddaughters she'd raised in a house with no harmonicas in it. In the spring of 2024, a notice was taped to the inside of a shop window in Hessler, Tennessee. 3 months behind, $9,300 to make it current. 9 days to a foreclosure sale on the courthouse steps. Eli sat at the kitchen table that night under the one good light, the compass in his hands. He'd taken it down off the mantel without deciding to, and he turned it over, the strange tower catching the bulb, and he did not open it because he'd promised a 6-year-old he wouldn't, and a promise doesn't expire just because the person it was made to is 24 and gone. He had $147 in the bank. He set the compass down where the notice could see it, and he said, to the empty kitchen, the only prayer he had left that wasn't work, I kept it safe. Whatever else I lost, I kept it safe. He didn't know that 3 women were already in 3 cars on the interstate, driving north through the dark. And he didn't know that they weren't only bringing money. Della, in the lead car, had a folder on the seat beside her. A thing a guilt-sick man named Keller had finally handed across the table. A thing with Danny's signature at the bottom and a notary's stamp and 17 years of dust on it. They were bringing the truth, dug up at last, and they were not coming alone. The auction was set for 9 in the morning on the courthouse steps, and by 8:30 most of Hessler had found a reason to be near the square. People who'd bought their groceries off the same shelves as Eli Tanner for 30 years stood in clusters and didn't quite look at the steps. Conrad Pyle was there in a clean vest near the front, the way a man stands near a thing he started and can't stop watching. A speculator from the county seat had driven over with a checkbook and the comfortable look of someone who buys other people's bad years for cents on the dollar. Eli stood off to the side with his hands in his coat pockets and the canvas medic bag over one shoulder, because he hadn't known what else to bring, and it was the thing he reached for. He'd decided not to fight it out loud. A man could lose a house with his mouth shut. He'd had practice losing things quietly. At 8:41, the first black SUV came around the square, then the second, then the third. They didn't belong in Hessler any more than they had 18 years before, and the crowd turned to watch them the way the crowd always turns. The doors opened, 3 women got out, and a man near Eli said, "Who in the world?" And then the square filled with a sound nobody there ever forgot, because behind the 3 SUVs, rolling in slow off every road into the square, came trucks. Pickups and work vans and a chartered bus and more pickups. And out of them came men and women in ball caps and field jackets and pressed dress blues that didn't fit like they used to, 200 of them and then more. Danny Ledford's old unit and the State Veterans Association the sisters had spent 2 weeks on the phone with, and Gus Renner's whole post, and they did not shout and they did not rush. They walked into the square and they arranged themselves, without anyone telling them how, into a thing that was unmistakably a formation, and they stood at the foot of the courthouse steps between Eli Tanner and the auctioneer, and they faced out toward the crowd, and they waited. The auctioneer looked at his paper. He looked at the 200 people who had appeared between him and his job. He cleared his throat and did not begin. Della crossed the square to Eli first. She was 31, and she was a doctor, and she was for 1 second 13 again, and she stopped in front of him and couldn't get the first word out. "You got tall," Eli said, which was the wrong thing and the only thing, and it broke her open, and she put her arms around him, and over her shoulder he saw Sloane already crying without any shame about it. The fighter, and behind her Wren, 24 now, slighter than her sisters. With their mother's face he could only assume, and their father's stubborn chin he knew for a fact. "The debt's paid," Della said into his coat. "All of it. We paid it an hour ago at the bank, before we drove over. There isn't going to be an auction." She pulled back and held him at arm's length the way he'd once held her. "The house is yours, clear, forever. We're not asking. We already did it. You can be mad later." He wasn't mad. He found he couldn't be anything yet. A man stepped out of the formation then, older, straight-backed, a retired colonel who'd commanded the battalion Eli and Danny had served in, and he didn't take the steps, but he raised his voice so the square could hear it, and what he said was not flowery. He said that the man standing on those steps had been a combat medic, one of the best he'd ever had, that he had personally watched Sergeant First Class Eli Tanner walk into places other men walked out of, to bring people back, and that the town had spent 17 years with the wrong idea of him, and the colonel was here to set it down right in front of everybody. Gus Renner said his piece after, shorter, just that this was the steadiest man he knew, same as he'd told a courtroom once when it hadn't been enough, and this time the square was listening. And then a fourth car came around the corner, slower than the others, and the crowd's murmur changed pitch, because some of the older ones remembered it. Vivian Ashford. She had come to manage it. That was the truth of it, and she'd have admitted it if asked. The flood rescue story had traveled again, the way it always traveled, a veteran and 3 orphaned girls, and the Ashford name was getting close to it once more, and she had come the way she always came, to stand near a fire and make sure it didn't reach her. She got out into a square that went quiet around her. She was 78 now, and the blade of her had not dulled. It was Conrad Pyle who ended it. Nobody had asked him to. He'd spent a week not sleeping, and that morning he'd put a folder in his truck without quite deciding to, and now he walked it across the square in front of the whole town, and he handed it not to Eli but to Della, because some part of him understood it was hers to open, and he said, loud enough to carry, in the voice of a man setting down something he'd carried too long, "I did a thing 17 years ago I've got no business carrying any further. The contract that got pulled off Tanner, that was me, and it was a favor for her people." He didn't look at Vivian. He couldn't. And there's more than that in there. Her own man came to me last week. Figured I'd earned the right to be the one to say it out loud, since I'm the one who helped her. He stepped back. His voice was not steady. "Sorry doesn't cover it. I know that." Marsh Keller was standing at the edge of the crowd. He had driven up on his own, told no one, and when the eyes started to find him, he didn't run from them. He'd kept his notes for a reason he'd never admitted, and the reason turned out to be this morning. "It's accurate," he said, "just that, to the square and to the woman who'd paid his salary for 30 years. All of it's accurate." The folder had Danny's guardianship document in it, the notarized one. The one that named Eli Tanner, the legal guardian of 3 children in the event of their father's death, signed 2 years before Danny died, filed where it belonged, recovered by the Ashford estate, and locked in a drawer for 17 years because it was the one thing that could have kept the girls where their father wanted them. Della read it standing in the square. Then she read it out loud, the relevant line in the clear carrying voice she used in the worst hour of strangers' lives. And the square understood all at once what it was hearing, that the man they'd whispered about for 17 years had been chosen, in writing, by the girl's own father, and that the woman who'd taken them had known it the whole time. Vivian Ashford stood in the middle of it, and did not reach for a lawyer, did not turn for the car, did not do any of the things a cornered, powerful person does. Later, people would describe her differently depending on what they needed her to be, but what actually happened was that she looked at Della, at her granddaughter holding a piece of paper that proved what she'd buried. And then she looked at Wren, the silent one, the baby, grown into a woman with Cora's exact way of standing, and something went out of her face that had been holding it up for a very long time. She had son 17 years ago. She had gotten the children and the bloodline and the heirs who looked right at the table. And she had never once, in all that time, been written a letter she wanted to answer, or carried through any floodwater, or waited for on a windowsill. She had set down a grief because it was good sense, and the good sense had cost her the only thing that couldn't be bought back. And she understood it now, in a public square, far too late, which is the only place understanding like that ever seems to arrive. She didn't speak. She got back in the car. By the end of the month, she had stepped down from the company that wore her name and resigned her seat on the family's charitable board, and the questions that follow a thing like this had begun their slow work, and the Ashford name spent a season meaning something it had never meant before. Eli watched the car go and felt no triumph in it, none. Only a tired old sorrow for a woman who'd had everything and arranged her life so carefully that she'd never had to hold any of it. Then Wren stepped forward, and the square got quiet in a different way. She was the youngest and the smallest, and she'd been the one who couldn't talk, and she climbed 2 steps so she could be seen, and her voice shook and held. "Most of you don't know me," she said. "I was 6. I didn't talk for the first 2 months I lived up that holler, and the man you've been telling stories about didn't push me and didn't give up. He left a harmonica on my windowsill and waited." She looked at Eli. There was a flood. My lungs quit on me in the dark, and there was no ambulance that could reach us, and he carried me a mile up a mountain in the water and taught me a code with my hand against his back, so I wouldn't be scared, and he sang the worst 4 notes you ever heard the whole way. A sound went through the crowd that was half laugh, half something else. He's not the door guy. He's not the fix-it fella. He's the reason all 3 of us are standing here. We just needed 17 years and a lot of help to come say so. Eli's face was wet, and he didn't wipe it. He'd stopped being ashamed of that a long time ago. What the sisters announced that morning, they'd built quietly over the spring, the 3 of them pooling what they'd each made on their own. Not $1 of it Ashford, all of it earned. The Eli Tanner Foundation, $75 million. It would rebuild or repair 40 homes in the county, starting with the ones whose roofs had been leaking longest, including, Sloanson said into the microphone with her father's chin set hard, the families who spent 17 years talking about a man who carried their neighbor's child through a flood. It would put 60 foster kids and children of veterans through school. It would build a rural emergency clinic so the next holler that flooded wouldn't be a mile from help. The Ledford Clinic, named for the father, so that Danny Ledford's name would mean arrived in time in this county forever. A trade program Sloan would run, a music therapy practice Wren would seed, and a thing for veterans coming home to catch the ones who cack back towns that looked at them like old fuse boxes. Conrad Pyle was still standing where he'd stepped back to. Eli walked over to him, the whole square watching, half of them braced for what a wronged man might say, and Eli put out his hand. Conrad looked at it like it might be a trick. It wasn't. They shook. "You didn't have to do what you did this morning," Eli said low, "just for the 2 of them. Costs you plenty. Costs me what it ought to. Holding on to a thing that long only hurts the one holding it." Eli let go of his hand. "I'd know. Put it down. That was all. No speech." He'd never had the stomach for speeches, and a man who needs to win twice never really won the first time. They went back up the holler in the late afternoon, the 4 of them in one car, the way it should have always been. The cabin was the cabin, creaking floors, the wood stove, the one chair multiplied now by folding ones the girls dragged in. And on the mantel, where it had sat for 17 years with the strange tower turned to the wall, was the brass compass. Eli took it down and held it out to Wren. "Right where you left it," he said. "I never opened it. Told you I wouldn't." Wren took it in both hands, the way she'd held it at 6. She opened the lid, and the needle still swung, still found north after all those years. And then she did the thing none of them had ever done, because the compass had only ever been a thing to hold on to, never a thing to look inside. She pressed the worn edge of the false bottom the way her mother had once shown her and forgotten she'd shown her, and it lifted, and under it was a square of paper folded small and soft with age. Her mother's handwriting, a letter Cora had hidden there for 3 daughters she must have known. Somehow she might not get to raise, tucked into the one thing she knew Wren would never let go of, and never had. Vivian had buried a great many things. She had never known about this one. No one had. It had ridden up a flooded mountain on Eli's back and sat on his mantle through every hard year and waited, unopened, kept safe by a man who keeps his promises, for the morning a grown woman would finally be ready to read it. Wren read it with her sisters pressed to either side of her, and Eli stepped out onto the porch to let them have it, and stood in the gold light with the medic bag still over his shoulder, and let them have it. 1 year on, Hessler is a different town. 40 roofs are sound that weren't. The Ledford Clinic runs a bay off the square, and the next time the creek came up, it was 9 minutes away instead of a flood and a prayer. Sloane's first trade school class graduated 19 kids the county had written off. Della keeps an apartment in town now, near her father's clinic, and works the worst hours of strangers' lives with a calm that has a Tennessee accent. Wren plays sometimes on the courthouse steps where the auction never happened, badly on purpose, 4 notes that aren't a song. And Eli Tanner is not alone in the cabin anymore. There's a boy upstairs in the room with the star sheets, 8 years old, the son of a man from Danny's old unit who came home and then couldn't find his way the rest of the way back, and the county called a number it had on file, the same number it's had since 1991, and a man who keeps his promises picked up the phone. The medic bag hangs on its nail. The compass sits on the mantel, lid open now, needle pointing the way it always did. And above the workbench, on a fresh strip of tape, 6 words in grease pencil. Because some things a man writes down again every year so he doesn't forget what they cost and what they're worth. Whoever's in front of you is yours to keep. I think about how close it came to going the other way, how a folded paper in a drawer almost decided everything, and how a folded paper in a compass almost stayed unread forever. Kindness doesn't pay back on any schedule. Sometimes it takes 17 years and 200 people in a square. But it keeps every promise it ever made, and it always, always finds its way home.